Welcome to this meeting of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. My name is Charlie Portlock and I'm the RSAA's Programmes and Media Secretary. Today we're joined by Anisa Sabiri, a Tajik filmmaker and producer who focuses on concepts of identity and memory, as well as the search for an indigenous Central Asian voice in cinema. Anisa advocates for a reimagined Central Asian narrative, one in which the region is positioned not as a colonial periphery, but as a central force in its own storytelling and cultural output. A novelist, photographer, and activist, Anisa's cinematography has been featured at the Busan International Film Festival, Documenta 15, and the Asian Film Archive. She has lectured and run filmmaking workshops at the University of Central Asia and the Institute for War and Peace, and has spoken at important international events associated with the Basel Peace Forum, UNESCO, TED, and the European Film Market. Today, Anisa will be discussing the obstacles facing Tajik artists as they attempt to find a distinctive cultural voice in local and international creative scenes, and how engaging with indigenous storytelling methods can open up a previously unexplored opportunity to achieve that. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Anisa to deliver her lecture, and as ever, we'll have time following her talk for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. So over to Anisa.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's great honor and responsibility to address the Royal Society of Asian Affairs about my culture. And today I will be discussing the tradition of storytelling in Tajikistan, exploring its cultural and historic roots, examining the progression it has undergone, and analyzing contemporary challenges that it faces. My overview of the history will begin with the Greater Khorasan, a vast Persianate area that shared a common cultural and linguistic mind space, and where, over a considerable period, some of the greatest Persian art emerged. Next, I will be discussing key concepts of medieval Persian art. Then we will examine the radical changes that occurred in the late 19th and 20th centuries following the Russian conquest of Central Asia and how it influenced art in the subsequent century. And finally, we will explore the early post Soviet period and consider the prospects for the future of Tajik storytelling. Tajik culture is Persianate, belonging to the eastern part of ancient Iran in particular, called the Greater Khorasan. It's a region which boundaries have varied considerably over time. At various points, it included significant cultural economic centers such as Bukhara, Samarkand, Kabul, Damascus, Nishapur, Herat, Mashhad, Balkh, Baghdad, amongst others. And this area has always been a dynamic linguistic religious melting pot where important trade routes crisscross the region, circulating wealth, knowledge, ideas, providing a very fertile soil for art to flourish. And the splendid wall paintings of Afrasiab, Panjakent, Bunjakat, and many other towns are some of the fascinating examples of the art of that time, which tells us something about the storytelling, the composition, and what it looked like before the Arab invasion, which began in 635 AD, and the Arab conquest lasted for almost 1 century. And the invasion, known for its bloodshed, largely wiped out the pre-Islamic culture that existed there. So, as a historian, Ashrafi notes considerable time passed before the conquered people could resume their creative endeavors. The splendid wall paintings that we can see now, I think these are from Hermitage. They're now in collection of Hermitage. Yeah, but some of them in Tajikistan, some in Uzbekistan. So these beautiful wall paintings excavated in the ruins, literally from ashes, were destroyed during that period intendedly. Beginning with the 9th century, a new literary language, Farsi, Persian, Tajik, Dari, came to life and began to take shape. And the Tajik historian Akbar Tursun describes Farsi Tajik, which is really the same, as a system forming foundation of the ethnocultural identity of modern Tajiks and Persians. So over time, Farsi evolved not only into a lingua franca of the region, including the furthermost territories such as Turkey and India, but also connected us to the global world. By the 10th century, its development had paved the way for poetic genius Abu Abdullah Rudaki, considered as the father of Persian Tajik classical literature. He was born in near the town of Panjikent on the territory of modern Tajikistan, and most of his time worked in Bukhara. And Rudaki's poetic styles were further developed in subsequent centuries. In the 10th century, Firdausi created his epic Shahnameh. In the following centuries, literary innovators such as Anvari, Unsuri, Nizami, Saadi, Dihlavi, Khojandi, Rumi, and others emerged. It's interesting that since we were talking about the Greater Khorasan during like the 6th century prior to the Arab invasion, but even in the 11th century, the we can see the evidence of regional identities Khorasani in the writings of Anvari, who is one of the greatest Persian poets of that time. As poetry progressed, it opened up greater and wider possibilities for visual arts, in particular in illustration, and new poems and genres and plots inspired a variety of miniature paintings, which primary function was to illustrate books. As a historian Ashafi states, the deep, sincere accordance between miniature painting and poetry only emerged after a long and complex period of development. This process was ultimately connected with historical conditions and, in many instances, with various stages of literary evolution. And here we can see the early miniature paintings by one of the greatest miniature artists, Kamaluddin Behzad. Very beautiful compositions, quite static on one hand, but also dynamic within the composed image. And here there is an illustration for the timeless 12th century Sufi poem by Fariduddin Attar, called Mantiq al-Tayr, known in the West as the Conference of the Birds, which unfolds a very important layer to be considered as a feature of Persian storytelling, which is its symbolism and the multi-layered meaning. So Mantiq al-Tayr centers on the Hoopoe, a spiritual guide figure leading the birds on the perilous search for their king, the mythical ground bird Simurgh. On their long journey, they evolve from being young songbirds to fully mature ones, and the birds undergo trials and tribulations that lead them to realize that Simurgh is present within them, revealing the essential divinity in human beings. One of significant features of the structure of Mantiq al-Tayr is that it's non-linear. It's like a mosaic of different dialogues and stories and odes. And the story exemplifies how the soul progresses towards enlightenment and union with God, and is one of the most outstanding works of Sufism. It's characterized by allegory and spiritual quests, self-discovery, and divine love. And Sufi literature, as we see in Mantiqotar and many other works and Sufi poetry, is very rich with allegorical storytelling, and it uses it as a medium to convey spiritual truths and teachings in a highly figurative way, which would be comprehensible both by an ordinary person not familiar with the spiritual, and also would be understandable by a person who is familiar with these practices. And imagination in Sufism is a vast topic, which sort of is embedded in, um, again, the Persian storytelling in general, and it's articulated in the concept of hayal, the Arabic word commonly translated into English as imagination. And in analyzing the human soul, Sufism reflects the idea that we perceive things in three ways: by the senses, by the imagination, and by intellect. And the Conference of Birds elaborates upon the ambiguity of theophany and imagination in detail. Attar tells us that everything is an image of God, so everything is at once a face and a veil, a disclosure and concealment. And when Ibn Arabi explains the meaning of hayol in this regard, he insists that everything the word um, properly designates falls into the realm of the in between the sense of perception and the intellect. So, but it's not only in so-called high art it was embedded, but also in embroidery works and other arts and crafts. Suzani is a large decorative hand embroidered wall panel. As we can see, it's very colorful. I mean, one on the right, it's faded because of the sun, probably, and just like an antique Suzani, which is still very beautiful because of the composition and the colors. So I decided to use it as well. But yeah, so in these Suzanis, each element forms part of the universe. That's the composition, the principle of the composition. And young women used to prepare such carpets for their weddings, trying to demonstrate the worldview and the reaction to the surrounding, to the aesthetical comprehension of the world. During the previous Soviet time, it was quite important, an important form of storytelling. And as a well-known Tajik artist Munira Kilova mentions, with embroidery, there should always be one line at least left incomplete, as a sign that only God can create something perfect. Isn't it beautiful and poetic? Um, and yeah, so now we gradually came to the Soviet period. Very interesting period indeed. Um, which started as a result of the Great Game at the end of 18th century. Well, not the Soviet period itself, but the Russian conquest of Central Asia, um, which followed by the Bolshevik invasion in the early 20th century. And this very complex history, accompanied by industrialization and erasure of the intelligentsia, shaped a new identity, a Soviet passport holder who um, had to exist under unprecedented centralized government control. And Farhat Atayi, a researcher in his book Soviet Cultural Legacy in Tajikistan, writes that never in the history of mankind had the totality of such activities in an entire empire been directed, controlled, and managed exclusively by the state. As such, it was a unique and unprecedented experiment that left a long-lasting impact on people's life, their worldviews, and aspirations. In my opinion, the Tajik people have one of the most piteous fates in the Soviet history. First of all, because of being disconnected with the Tajik fellows from Afghanistan. They were completely disconnected with Iran, and the creation of states and the Soviet national politics served geopolitical and economic interests, which led to isolation of the nation in, at that time, quite undeveloped mountainous regions. And perhaps the most painful part of the Soviet history, apart from losing some of the best people, major historic cities and the spiritual and historic center of Bukhara it was a loss of language as well. And this began first with the change of Farsi um, to the Latin script, and then the Cyrillic script, and then continued with the education system prioritizing the Russian language as a language of education, and just a language which was um, much more practical and the language of the ruling elite. And the Tajik language was no more studied at schools, or even if there were some schools, very rare, it was not the best education because everything was written in Russian. I mean, obviously, all the books and tragic consequences of the Bolshevik invasion was the erasure of language, which was almost erased, and also the desecration of books and devaluation of the knowledge which was produced during all these long centuries. So the erasure of the Anthropocenic past. And Rustam and Sharif Shukurov's, in one of their works, highlights the destruction of texts written in Farsi and Arabic by the Bolsheviks, describing how stories persist of books being cast into rivers, disintegrated into mere scraps of papers, and literally flowing in rivers of Amudarya and Sirdarya, which is quite a tragic image of that time. And they highlight the destruction of the text written in Farsi and Arabic as one of the most egregious acts of cultural vandalism, a profound loss to world heritage, in which attempts were made to erase best of examples of world literature such as Rumi and Hafez. We must indeed talk about the and understand the significance of the loss of language, especially language such as Farsi, which carries a lot of knowledge of the past, especially the storytelling traditions, and aesthetical and world viewing qualities. And indeed, modern linguistic theories now have developed a lot of concepts about the importance of language as a tool for thinking, as a foundation for thinking. And in this case, the shift from Farsi, which is read and written right to left, to the European left to right manner, is a significant shift in the way of thinking. Also, Farsi is a very symbolic language. It's a very symbolic and aesthetically powerful writing as well. And it did indeed push the local population, the Farsi-speaking population, at least the next generations, which were disconnected with their language, to become a Russian human, or maybe something in between. And I like what Cassier writes, that all theoretical cognition takes its departure from a world already performed by the language. The scientist, the historian, and even the philosopher lives with his objects only as language presents to him. So that was quite an important shift. And then on that new ground, new forms and ways of storytelling brought by Russians And now in 1924, we can see that the first Central Asian film studio called Bukkino, it was Russo-Bukharian film studio, film company. It was founded in Bukhara. And for Soviet power, cinema became a key tool for spreading the propagandistic messages and ideas, with films being financially, technically, and ideologically dependent on Moscow produced exotic, self orientalizing works intended to serve the state propaganda. Over almost 70 years in the USSR, Central Asian filmmakers were almost never able to liberate themselves from the Moscow influence. Maybe with exception during the perestroika time, but that was, yeah, that's the next chapter. But during most of the Soviet time, all screenplays had to be approved by the state committee called Goskino, and distribution was dependent on its approval. Um, Cinemas were state funded, and all arts education required students to follow the style of the course master, usually a celebrated artist who did not welcome the originality and authenticity of their students. Um, and we must admit that during that time, with such a significant financial opportunity and film market and art market in the Soviet Union, because it was also a big territory, um, films that were produced, they're quite fascinating because there was a lot of, you can see there was a lot of film crew. Everyone was very well paid, and they had the best achievements in technical equipment and editing and so on. However, the final result, the act of art, was never independent and never free. So this is a very interesting paradoxical example of art that was not independent but yet very interesting in terms of its production and quality. Um, However, not the content, like not artistic quality. And I brought examples of um, films, quite significant films of that Soviet Tajik era. The films produced by various artists, filmmakers who were serving the Soviet Goskino. It's Boris Kimyagarov "Судьба поэта," A Poet's Fate, about the life of the poet Abdullah Rudaki, as I mentioned earlier, known as the father of the Persian Tajik language and poetry, and mainly poetry and literature. And the film was made in Russian, which is really interesting. The same thing happened to the trilogy based on the Persian epic of Shahnama, um, Сказание о Рустаме, Rustam and Suhrab, and the Tale of Rustam. So this trilogy, which was some of the most expensive films during the Soviet time, was also in Russian. So what it means is that the supposedly Persian-speaking Persians were learning about their own history through through the Russian language, and the sound they were um, left without the sounding of the original language, which indeed is never delivering the same essence and the same meaning, even because every word in Persian means so many things. And if, as we have discussed and saw earlier, there's a lot of Sufi symbolism, and even the rhythm is very important, of course, in poetry especially. So that was what the Tajik Kazakh academic says. Safar Abdullah says about the translation. There's always a kiss through the glass. So that was a kiss through the glass to the original local storytelling, but never the same as the original. And yeah, as I'm saying, films like this were quite supported because it was paradoxically the national kind of support of national identity. However, never intended to be entirely pure. Um, and the same thing happened. The same fate had happened to other forms of art as well, um, where artists had the best possible education in Russian universities, financial support, stipends. However, what they could produce was always, as a historian Fritz de Jong writes, uh, looked something art of Central Asia has one thing in common: they look upon the world with the eye of an outsider, an onlooker, or a passerby. Um, but then the glasnost happened, the famous perestroika, which started in 1985. It was a great time because um, it's a period that laid the foundations for some amazing thought, art, profoundly different from any other era of the Soviet time. Um, an artist's contributions to art, including poetry, music, and cinema and paintings, embodied a synthesis of strong artistic training, which the Soviet Union has had throughout its time, engagement with national identity, because now it was possible to talk about that, and creative responses to the changing political and cultural landscape, balancing Soviet influences, positive Soviet influences, with a desire to express Tajik identity and stories in its best way. Um, and one significant reason for the success of Perestroika era art, I believe, was the newfound freedom, which came on the foundation of a strong education, um, albeit Russian-centered. However, with the rise of decolonial discussions, it was revisited and approached in a completely different way. It did require longer time, of course. However, it was perhaps sadly short. The time was too short. Sadly for Tajikistan, because the other republics they gradually moved into the more logical way of independence. However, Tajikistan had its bloody civil war, but we will get there soon. Um, but yeah, during the perestroika time, it's not surprising that there was it was the feeling of the arising something new, the sleeping, getting waking up from the sleep which lasted so long for 70 years. And it's not surprising that the Muhammad Iqbal's, the Pakistani poet, decolonial poem Arise, a sleeping bud, like a Vigilant Narcissus, Arise, became so popular and reflected a lot of that time. And there are a lot of great examples of artists who we could talk about here, but I decided to bring an example of a profound musician, composer, and Dalir Nazarov, whose style was a combination of the Tajik rock and classic Persian poetry. Um, and it's a very interesting artist because his approach was very decolonial. If not, I don't know if it was intended, but it worked so interesting as a blend of everything that could have been achieved within this by his time, um, and a great work with the Anthropocenic past with a contemporary. Let's listen to his sample. It's very interesting. The name of the song also reflects the reception it had but yes, as I mentioned, all the different fake pieces they told about this about this physical limitations that still exist. So in the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, unfortunately for the Republic of Tajikistan, and not in a happy way, because we had a civil war that officially lasted from 1992 to 1997, but unofficially continued much longer. Um, and it was a time of deconstruction, total destruction of everything, and in a country of approximately 5 million population, around 200,000, and some historians say it's 500,000 people left, emigrated, and many were killed or died of hunger. So it was a very tragic part of it. It is a very tragic part of our history. Um, and however, even though it was so bad, the echo of the previous decades, all that knowledge and experience, was still alive in the film industry, with great names coming from Tajikistan, such as Bakhtiar Khodanazarov, Jamshed Usmanov, Margarita Kasimova, and many others, um, who were sort of carrying that heritage and the perestroika vibes, and during the 90s created some of the best examples of Tajik cinema. However, while tracing their heritage to Tajikistan, they emigrated because during the war it was very hard, even like the post-war country, it was very hard to create. There was no the film industry was almost entirely no, not almost, but entirely destroyed. Um, and storytelling in Tajikistan has faced numerous challenges since then. As I so um, when the war wiped everything out, then in the early post-war period, all the efforts were put um, into reconstructing the country, basically, from the ruins, and there were a lot of NGOs which sometime later started financing the art field and the civil society. However, it has decreased significantly by 2010, and especially by now, as Tajikistan became gradually as a country of less priority for international funding, especially in art field. And I suppose it also is somehow resonating with the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan, because we share the longest border with Afghanistan, it's around 1,000 miles, even more. And in a small country like Tajikistan, without external support or significant local funding, significant shifts in the arts field and industry are extremely challenging. Um, because there is also the lack of comprehensive academic education. Because of the wartime, there was a very strong gap but also a lot of the Tajik Soviet artists, they were studying in Moscow, so it was like kind of the country disintegrated, and then the new institutions just did not really emerge because of the practical reasons. So, for example, studying film, one of the most expensive professions in the art industry to learn, often requires significant funding, traveling abroad, because film schools are usually outside of the country and the region even, and of course the knowledge of foreign language. But this is the same with other art fields as well. And within the existing Tajik art landscape, the general trend, because there is no alternative, is still a continuation of this Russian Soviet so-called academic traditions in art, albeit on a scale limited by industry challenges and the lack of market, obviously. It's a situation in neighboring countries, at least some of them, features more alternative contemporary movements in the field of arts due to greater access to the local or international funding, bigger markets, of course, which also helps to form some support as well, bigger audiences, and the belonging to the Turkic language market as well, and more economic opportunities, where the Persian speaking market, although it could have been large, but it's not really experiencing its best time, I suppose. So, for instance, some of our neighboring countries with these trends, with larger markets, and also, I suppose, different geopolitical position, have much more funding resources from outside as well. For instance, the British Council's international cooperation grants, which is one of the most important and large funding grants you can get in Central Asia, exists only in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It's not really available in Tajikistan, and we also don't have institutions such as Goethe Institute, British Council, and Open Society, and so on, which were kind of some of the key sources for artists in the past. Some of them existed, some of them don't exist anymore, and some of them just never existed in Tajikistan. And indeed, this is a significant challenge because being an artist, especially an independent one, is very difficult in any country, even very, very advanced in terms of the economic development. Sometimes it's just much easier to find some funding outside of the country. However, there is still a challenge of being a representative of a little known country which has about which there are a lot of stereotypes and cliches, expectations of global markets to or programs or labs developing the projects in terms of their demands to be political, an artist to be political or exoticizing their region or their country. So it's kind of multi-layered challenge for artists from countries like Tajikistan, and I'm sure that it happens with a lot of other countries as well. And I know that Central Asian artists experience that exotization of their places as well, and that's like a common trend which needs to change for sure. But there's no real solution for that in the short term. You know, only maybe that we can try to educate the industry better and try to make some shifts. But I was also thinking what can be done within and outside of the industry internationally, where we can work with educating it and changing the approach. What can be changed in Central Asia itself, in Tajikistan, for instance. And having taught Tajik and Central Asian emerging artists, I have been thinking of solutions which could allow to create a completely different model of for cinema and art within the current circumstances that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, the Tajikistani circumstances are much more complicated than even some neighboring countries. Not all of them, but some. And I came to the conclusion that the expectation for the so-called academic art, which is, again, the Soviet term, within the lack of academic education and no significant support and the dynamic economy is not really reasonable because there is no market for that. And if unlocking the local knowledge on a small scale, the potential may be much higher because the before the Soviet Union, there was no such academic institutions or system for developing artists and practicing their art. So I think discussions about the colonial approaches, learning how the pre-Soviet traditions and local pre-colonial practices, which historically did not require hyper-centralized system of education, industry, and control, and revisiting these storytelling traditions from the contemporary perspective might give a small yet confident step forward to build something new in future. And I think we just have this we have a lot to work with. We have a lot of leftovers from this past, quite rich and vibrant. However, there should be no expectation that it should come to a solid piece in a very short time. This is why my lecture has a strong focus on the Anthropocenic past, which I believe is very important to understand and research as sort of digging into pieces that we can use in the now. And indeed, after the 70 years of creating a new identity within a very Eurocentric system of thought, the Tajik art thinking has been significantly changed, if not disoriented. So a lot can be taken from that incredible part of the heritage and revisited and reimagined in the now. And speaking of the modern Tajik art, I'd like to draw your attention to the work of one of my favorite Tajik artists and friends, Oyat Shakurov. His piece is called Spartacus. It can be found on his website, which I mentioned here. I really like this image because it portrays something in this direction. It's a nostalgic and dreamy view at the beautiful city landscape. However, there are also new layers which do not belong to that landscape itself, and rather belong to the space in front of us or in front of the viewer, which might not even be the space of our own, because there is a distance between the windows and the space. And I think that multi-layered approach to some aesthetics further on some beauty, which can be observed through many layers. It's a very interesting way to comprehend the view that we can have onto our history and our heritage as well. And I think this artwork somehow represents what I've been trying to articulate with this lecture, speaking about layers and pieces that we can put together to create the new. And there is a beautiful saying by Rumi, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. Rumi. Farkhunda Boshet.
Great, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. So I've got a quick question, and then we've got some from the audience as well. So looking at cinema and the cinema sector today in Tajikistan, how much influence does Iran and Iranian filmmaking have on Tajik filmmaking today?
It's a very good question. There was a very strong influence of Iranian films in 2000s after the civil war, when a filmmaker called Mohsen Mahmalbaf moved to Tajikistan and started his film school there, and also produced several films such as Sukut, Silence, and Sex and Philosophy. And he sort of united around himself a lot of amazing artists who just started their career, and some of them, they were also from the Soviet school. But that was an exciting time which was very promising for the like recentering of the Iranian cinema to Tajikistan and its migration to Tajikistan. However, unfortunately, he left Tajikistan for some reasons, political reasons, and then also the situation changed a lot, and I think the taste of Mohsin Makhmalbaf has left in the Tajik cinema, but it's not anymore as powerful and strong, which I think is also interesting because on one hand, Iranian cinema is very symbolic and is definitely one of the greatest examples of how the civilizational ideas of Great Khorasan could exist in contemporary cinema. However, it's also declining now, and it's not as powerful as it used to be, not maybe original. It tries to be also in many ways as Western cinema, just to be like Western cinema. So I think maybe that like the influence of the past, it would be good to preserve it, but the current cinema in Iran has changed and became very Westernized as well.
Right, thank you. So one of the questions from the audience is, do Tajiks identify with the great classical Persian poets such as Hafez and Rumi, or more with Tajik-born poets like Rudaki?
Well, it's very interesting. It's a good question. I mean, I'm not indeed a historian of of literature, but as a Tajik, I would say that um, I wouldn't I wouldn't put borders here. I wouldn't divide Rudaki from Hafiz because they lived within the same Great Khorasan space, and they both belong to the Persianate. And I think I even more stand. I look more for. I agree with the approach where Hafiz and Rudaki, they rather belong to the East Iranian traditions of poetry, where it emerges and where actually the Iranian language was born in Bukhara. It was a child of great innovation and experiments in 9th century Bukhara. So they for me they rather belong more to this Eastern Iran rather than Western Iran of that time, because then yes, of course, the migration happened, and there were a lot of political changes there, and the space was really big, and for me they both are similarly Baghdadi and from Damascus and Bukhara and Iran, and there is no difference between them in this regard, I would say.
And so,
Tajikistan is a very modern concept,
yeah, and sort of a follow-on question to that from the same person is that this classical Persian literature, is it something that's taught in schools that ordinary people read, or is it something that's sort of reserved for the elites in Dushanbe?
I think it's amazing because you still can go to villages where a 5-year-old would read, Buiju Mulyan or Yatami, and it's really amazing because to see, I think there are not many places in the world where you can go and hear the 9th century poetry from a 5-year-old, and I definitely I had this experience, and I think it's just something that unites people of like elderly and the young generation. However, maybe the meaning of it, which has many layers, is not as well comprehended everywhere and by everyone. Of course, the intelligentsia, they understand, they understand a lot about the. You can talk about the several meanings of one word, like Agaron Turkish Shirazi, what is Turk? Is it a Turk nation? Is it a Turk by nation, or is it a beauty, or is it something else? And all these discussions, because Persian language is so it has so many meanings in every word, and there are a lot of interpretations. But indeed this should be taught at schools, and I know that for a very long time these things were not taught at school. Now I think they now there is a lot more of emphasis to the national language and um, the national poetry. However, which is very sad and again refers us to a lot of decolonial discussions. A lot of people want their kids to speak Russian and talk and learn Russian and they prefer to send their children to Russian speaking schools. And this is something that is not really, because the government does not, there are options to learn these things, which is provided by the government, but people don't want because they think that, well, now, in future our child will go and study in Russia, or maybe they will work there. And these economic obstacles, unfortunately, are leading to the way of understanding.
So you've spoken quite a lot about the challenges facing modern filmmakers in Tajikistan. So another question that we got was, given the challenging political and economic environment in Tajikistan, how can outsiders best empower and support a new generation of the country's storytellers?
I think it's very important to build an industry, to approach the industry of art, and I suppose maybe it's the same in academia, I don't know, with with the consideration of everyone as equal, and everyone who's coming from different backgrounds should be able to have a free and safe space to explore their own, their own skills and powers that they have, just even coming from different way of thinking or different type of storytelling. And one of an interesting examples that I had recently, I'm supervising a student who was recently pitching at the big platform. It was her first international pitch, and her story is her first feature. She never attended labs or anything like that, but she has an amazing story and she's an amazing, artist. But when she was participating at the lab, which was in Tajikistan, but like coming from a foreign country, her story has changed so much that there was nothing left after she finished this program. And then she went to pitch her story, and the first thing that was imposed on her was to request a very big political statement, that would first of all endanger her as an artist, because this is how the world exists, unfortunately, but also that she didn't really mean that in her story. And this story definitely any story can be twisted in many ways. So I was helping her with her trailer, and then we had this like really long discussion, and then she said, "Well, Anisa, I really, I'm so sad that I don't want to be a filmmaker like this. I want to just make my film the way I imagined it." So then we edited her trailer the way that she did, and everybody liked the trailer. But the first intention was, it is just so easy to make this, wrong pathway. And a lot of artists, of course, they go for it because it's an opportunity to be selected and to get the funding. Because otherwise, it is very unfortunate that the international funding exists in a way that, and the industry, that we are only interesting as exotic objects. And I'm talking not about Tajikistan, but also like, countries from the periphery of so-called periphery, which is not really true. And you're either an exotic object that needs to tell the story from a very exotic way that would justify the audience in their beliefs that they emancipate, or they invest in something that belongs to the concept of freeing the periphery, and the ideas of human rights in the way only in the way that the West believes in. So I think this is an interesting time when we can sort of switch this perspectives and also say, well, we're actually not the periphery. Every center is the center, because that's the world, the place where I'm standing now. This is the center, and there should be no request for exotic stories or political stories in certain ways, because yeah, I mean, everything should be considered with the specifics and place where it comes from, I think.
Yeah, and I think just following on from that, there's I know recently some Tajik films have come out using sort of endangered Pamir languages, and do you think modern cinematography has a role to play in keeping those endangered languages and other endangered parts of Tajik culture alive for future generations?
Well, I think it's very important to use cinema and other art for the preservation of what we have. And I mean, yeah, definitely. But I think it's very important to see what is the intention there, rather than, okay, we're doing it because it's a political thing, which can be sold very well and so on. Yeah, I think that's the approach I would say, which is important, because in the end of the day, I mean, yeah, of course we can sell stories and do stories, make stories which are for the market, which is absolutely fine. We make stories which are just important for an artist, which is also fine. And there is a great diversity of arts there, and it should be like that. So I'm not saying that this shouldn't be done or should be done. However, I think for artists, it's just very important to stay genuine, and to be able to stay genuine in a way.
So I think we've come to the end of our time there, although we could have kept going with questions forever. So I just want to say a big thank you to you for taking the time to come and give us that very interesting lecture. For RSAA members, the next event we've got coming up is on the 18th of June, where we have a visit to the Ranjit Singh exhibition at the Wallace Collection. And then following that, we have the annual general meeting and the Lord Denmer Memorial Lecture given by the Right Honourable Alistair Burt on the 10th of July. So hopefully we will see you at either or both of those. But other than that, all I want to say is another big thank you to Anisa, and yes, we look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you.